Hello YouTube, this is Morgan, Airspeed Prime here with my next Avatar video. So this one, as you probably got from the title, is going to be about something that information basically that we get in the Reckoning of Roku. So just be aware, basically full spoilers for the book. It's only been out a week, so that's why I'm not starting off just with all the information on screen. So if you haven't read the book kind of in full, maybe kind of wait to watch the video, but otherwise I am going to get straight into it because it is about stuff that is more towards the end of the book. But anyway, let's start. So what we're talking about here is this apparent error issue, continuity error, whatever way you want to call it, when it comes to the Great Comet, aka Sozin's Comet, as presented in this book. So straight away, the passage is obviously from one of the Sozin chapters. He heads to Wan Shi Tong's library to look up information, and we get this little paragraph. So continuing on from the previous one, celestial objects like the Great Comet too magnified the strength of their bending, but that the next time the Great Comet passed wouldn't be for another 44 years. So I'll give the full context here just so you're with me on this and you're not maybe super into the numbers. So in this book, we are dealing with 16-year-old Roku and thus 16-year-old Sozin. Sozin goes to visit Wan Shi Tong's library as part of his quest for information on unique firebending techniques, as well as ways to increase bending power. This is where he gets to also looking up information on comets and so on. So he learns that yes, as the legends tell, you can in fact increase your firebending power by harnessing the power of a comet that passes by. And he finds out from the text just above that the Great Comet, so the one they all know about, is going to come around next time in 44 years. So straight away, some of you might be thinking, wait, what's the issue here? But if you know your numbers, you can probably get a sense that that is a bit of a problem. So the obvious error with this is that you obviously, as fans, with the information that we have, what we consider to be canon, this reads like an error, and unless we factor in a bunch of stuff that we don't necessarily need to, this reads completely as if this is an error. The timing of the comet's arrival is off by 22 years. For it to be correct, the number that the book says should be 66 years until the comet arrives. Now, the logic behind this, if you want the explanation, is that the next comet that comes, again based on the information that we have, should be the time that the Great Comet basically becomes known as Sozin's Comet. Sozin using the comet to start the war and wipe out the air nomads. Basically, establishing this event as 0BG/0AG on the sort of fan wiki timing system that we use, where for the most part, most dates are in relation to Sozin's Comet being used in this particular incident to cause the air nomad genocide. So that's why it's a quite serious continuity kind of thing here, because we're dealing with this central point in a way, and this maybe potentially is messing with that. So obviously we need to get into some of the numbers here. So we know that this happens when Sozin is 82. So he uses the comet to wipe out the air nomads when he is 82. The reason we know this is because this has to be 12 years after Roku's death, which is when Aang is 12 because of the cycle of the Avatar, meaning that, of course, 12 years on, Sozin's 82, and he has to use the comet when Aang is 12 because that's when Aang goes into ice. Aang runs away, and so he misses the attack on the air nomads. Sozin doesn't find him. This is why Aang is the last airbender. This whole sequencing has to be in this way. That you can't not have this happen here. Obviously, we know Roku's death is at 70. That is confirmed for sure. And so we know exactly when this all happens. And just based on I think other details in the episode, you can't just change it from 66 to 44 because the characters are going to look way older than what they're meant to be. That whole sort of idea. So yes, Sozin is 16 in the book. And so it is 66 years until he is 82. And this is when the comet has to come. Like, there has to be a comet this year. So whether you treat the whole a comet comes in 44 years as being the case or not, one also has to come 66 years on from this event for the universe to work, basically. So without assuming any retcons or specific details, it is an error. What this then says, of course, is that the comet does come twice in quick succession. Once when Sozin and Roku are 60 years old, so 10 years before Roku dies. But then also, the comet then has to come 22 years later, which is the comet that Sozin uses to start the war. So the contradiction that this then presents is that it obviously retcons the idea that the comet comes once every 100 years, and that being a set rule with the comet. So, you know, that's the thing here. It's not like we never had a how often the comet comes around piece of information, and so we just learned about a comet that we didn't know about. No, there is a kind of retcon contradiction in here, if this is actually meant to be the case. But getting into some kind of opinion on this, of course, you know, if it is simply an error, fair enough. But it does need to be acknowledged. This is where you need to come out and say it. You know, you need to update future print copies of the book to have that 44 number changed to 66. But if it is an error, despite, you know, the idea, yes, sometimes these things happen, it's complicated, but it's a really, really bad error because of how important this date is to, you know, everything, basically. You shouldn't be getting the details around this wrong. Like, pretty much anyone involved in the process in the book, if they know anything about Avatar, really should not be making a mistake with this years. And it being off by such a big margin is pretty telling. Like, it is really bad. Like, it to the point where I struggle to believe that this book will have passed through the hands of so many people before it finally gets finalized and approved. There's no way, surely, that a mistake like this could get into the final print run of the book. Because, yeah, we know for a fact everything relating to Avatar Studios, relating to Avatar, goes through approvals that eventually hits Avatar Studios. This is everything from merchandise to, of course, the new content that comes out, whether it be comics or the novels. That if you listen to recent interviews with Randy Rabai, he talks about the collaboration process is very much, he writes it, they approve it, and that's how kind of the stuff is made, basically. So, you know, you have the writer himself, you have editors, then it gets to people at Avatar Studios. And as far as we're aware, Avatar Studios does have people that are pretty much there specifically to check for continuity, to make sure there aren't really errors. So the idea is, how does something so basic, so fundamental to Avatar slip through? I don't really know. So there's the discussion I'm going to have here with that in mind. Let's say it's not an error. Let's assume that Avatar Studios is very, very competent and that, okay, suddenly it's not an error. How can this make sense? So straight away, there has to be some weirdness going on with the book, or there's some, like, basically retconning stuff, some stuff like isn't canon anymore. That's basically what's happening here. So the first one that I saw someone suggest on one of my videos when I mentioned this is that, well, maybe it's just as simple as, like, the information in Wan Shi Tong's library is wrong, inaccurate. Like, we can't treat it, like, at all times as being for sure this is completely correct information. And the idea is that from Korra, we know this can happen because, of course, when Jinora goes to the library, Wan Shi Tong has wrong information about how radios work, and Jinora has to tell him how they actually work. Now, I do think, you know, I'll do this bit first, that, you know, okay, the misinformation about how radios work, it's a joke, but also read into the character arc for Wan Shi Tong. In this era, he has taken his library back to the spirit world, and so he's not really involved himself with humans anymore. He's stepped away, and he stepped away at a key point for the physical world where it's having this technological kind of boom that we saw going from the end of the war into Korra's era. And so he's kind of missed a lot of this by not being there. And I think that's what it's meant to explain. And the idea is that Wan Shi Tong, as far as we're aware from like the RPG, is going to start, to involve himself with humans once again. He's going to give humans another shot. I'm guessing at some point maybe the library will come back to the physical world, or will just be in a more obvious place, maybe in the spirit world, and we'll see what happens there. But the idea is that this dynamic shouldn't really be at play in the Roku era, because of course Sozin is just allowed to go in once he gives Wan Shi Tong a piece of information. I also, just on the other side of this, I don't like the idea that we're going to do this sort of, doubting the validity of information as a plot point, that this is purposefully written in to be wrong, with the idea that we think about it and then they'll do something with it down the road that proves that it's wrong. To me, you had to put some doubt in our heads, like immediately, that you're aware of this, and we know you're aware of this type thing. Whereas, as you can see, it is just presented, boom, wouldn't be for another 44 years, and it's never referenced again in the entire book. So I don't really think they wrote it in a way where you can do it in this really kind of questioning way. It's maybe a get out of jail free kind of solution if they want to do that, so they don't have to like correct anything potentially. But I don't like this as the reality of the situation. Especially because as part of the book, the library is used as part of Sozin's plot to like confirm information that he previously only knew as legends. That he goes to the library and finds out that, yes, you can train to change the color of your fire. Yes, you can learn to generate lightning. You can learn to redirect lightning. All these techniques, basically, that he thought of as like being legends of Fire Nation history are actually valid techniques that can actually be learned. And harnessing power from the comet is actually a thing. And the library, of course, has information about, when this stuff is going to happen again. And I think especially because like we know the library is very important in relation to the dates of celestial kind of things happening. Literally the episode, The Library. I find it very difficult to believe that in a book they purposely wrote a date of one of these things being wrong. So I'm not a fan of this one, though I suppose they could use it. Meaning that we probably have to get into the other thing. If it's not an error, we suddenly have to accept that something somewhere that we know right now has been either changed, made non-canon, or is being retconned, basically. So we have to go over the details of what we know about the comet, how do we know specific pieces of information, and try and pick apart what is and isn't correct. So straight away, one thing is how do we know for sure that the Great Comet is Sozin's comet? It's said directly by Sozin in 306, and multiple other places refer to it as it gets name changed when he uses it, basically. So there's no question there. They're talking about the exact same comet, and I don't think there's any room to negotiate really here. To me, the big one, that if this is the direction they're going in, this is probably what is being changed. And that is that the idea that the comet is without fail every 100 years exactly is when it returns. This detail is not stated in an episode of the show. So it's not in one of the absolute like top tier kind of sources of information. It is not said in an episode. Of course, they acknowledge that the time between the last time the comet came and it coming back again is 100 years, but they don't say anything about like that this is consistently the way the comet always works, that it's every 100 years. It's just that happens to be the timeline this time. Where the whole every 100 years comes from, I think originally, is the old Nickelodeon website. So obviously it's not up anymore, but it has been archived on Tumblr, and here is the post. It returns every 100 years, and that's the only real kind of significant piece of information that we need to know. So old Nickelodeon website confirms it, and then it is also referenced in the RPG core book, but it is in a kind of gameplay / how to play section rather than directly in the lore section. So I don't know how to necessarily reference that as such. Is that just like casually thrown in there? Is the lore accuracy of here's how you play the game, even kind of thought of necessarily when these books are put together outside of like obvious errors? I'm not really sure, but it just highlights that detail that is kind of essential to all of this is from like lesser sources, basically, because in 108 Roku just tells Aang the comet is returning after 100 years. He doesn't say that it's always every 100 years. That's just this gap that we're dealing with here. So is the retcon to make this work that the comet returns kind of at least once in every 100-year period, as in the longest time between returns of the comet is going to be 100 years, but that it can return earlier, which would explain the situation we have in the book and make that the numbers actually line up. So the comet returns as stated, but then it does return again 22 years later. And this has to be the case for the 44 number to work, because you can't just adjust things so that the centerpiece of the timeline, effectively 0 BGAG, is actually like Sozin at 60. Because all of a sudden you adjust one thing and that by itself adjusts like so many other things, and I don't think they want to mess with that like at all. Whereas I think the idea is that it is a little bit more acceptable that potentially the comet is a little bit more random, but we have to of course wait and see. Yeah, there being two comets as well is kind of an interesting point. It definitely helps to kind of highlight that, oh, okay, that explains how like Sozin's able to like maximize the use of the second comet, because he gets the first time where he doesn't really do anything of note with it, but he practices, he trains with it, he knows what it's capable of and what it's not capable of, and so he's fully prepared to launch his attack when the next comet comes in. And in a way, he happens to get lucky with the idea that there are two comets like back to back, and potentially it's this idea of he gets this really lucky thing where the comet goes really close together, but then it's the longest maybe one historically after this of like the full 100 years. So that's that. But yeah, the idea is still ultimately, is it an error? That's the simple solution, is that like it's an error, they put their hands up and just acknowledge it, and then it gets changed in future print copies of the book. Maybe digital files get updated to just say 66 instead of 44. That's one way to do it, to avoid like any error. That makes it kind of fully lore accurate. But if they want there to be this kind of weird dynamic where there is actually two comets back to back, and they want to make it so that the comet is a little bit more random, which I can see them maybe wanting to do, just in case they get into weird situations where we're like, oh, interestingly, the year that this thing takes place happens to also be the year the comet should arrive, and they don't want to deal with that kind of happening, but they have to use that year. Having the leeway with the idea that the comet is a little bit more flexible might be helpful for them in the future, in terms of being able to use the comet as part of future stories kind of whenever they need to. So we'll see what they do. Especially, I would say, bringing in a little bit of Netflix Avatar. Obviously, Netflix Avatar is its own continuity. What happens there doesn't necessarily mean it happens here, but it's interesting that just by definition, in a way, its use of the comet has to be different than in animation, as far as we're aware, where they're creating a situation where there's going to have to be a further time skip between seasons, meaning that there is actually going to be like 100 and something years between the comet. And very much, I think, the way that they calculate like when it's going to arrive it feels like it's a little bit more of a random thing rather than there's a set period of time when they know it's going to return in live action. So I'm wondering, have they maybe sorted some of that stuff out behind the scenes, and this is maybe the first example of that updated information being kind of included in canon. But we have to wait and see. So in the comments, let me know what your thoughts are on this apparent, seems relatively clear-cut error with the Great Comet. Do you treat this as just being a straight-up error, or do you think they are actually doing some interesting kind of like retcon type stuff, that they are introducing this idea of Sozin gets to use the comet like twice back to back, that potentially what has changed maybe is that they're taking out the idea that it's every 100 years exactly, and more just like, no, it comes once roughly every 100 years, but it can be much shorter, or it can maybe be even a little bit longer. There's a randomness to it. Are they doing that? Let me know in the comments below, or if you have a different theory. I definitely would like to know if you do have a different theory. But yes, that has been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.